Thank you, Chris, and good morning. How is everyone this morning? Good, we've got the early session. I think much better than the after lunch slot. So I guess welcome to this morning's session. What I'd like to cover over the next hour and a half is really take you through some of the structural concepts around risk management. And I was able to deliver this presentation late yesterday afternoon, and as I was looking at the program, I saw just such a great smattering of risk management, hazard management, risk assessment, managing risk in all different applications. And there's been a real shift in the last couple of years in this topic that it really is growing in momentum. So one of the things I wanted to do in this presentation today was really take you back a step to look at some of the higher level concepts and structures in the field of risk management so that you can place some of those other applications within context. In terms of my background, it's really interesting. I've been working in this field for about 15 or 16 years and got involved in the military context. And I guess for those of you with a military background, when you look at higher risk activities and you start looking at how you actually execute and use a formal or a structured approach on top of everything else you do, I guess you start asking the question, how much is enough? And one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is this topic of risk profiling. And one of the things that I'd like to do this morning is actually explain and differentiate the difference between risk profiling, risk management, and some of the tactical applications that you might have a depth of experience in. Before I get kick-started though, I just wanted to, was everybody at the dinner last night and listened to Stephen in the presentation? I sat there when he drew up those 3 circles, on the board, and I went, oh my goodness, he's fully stolen my presentation, because one of the concepts that we talk about in risk management are these 3 levels. So what were those 3 rings that he had last night? What was in the middle? Why. Okay, the why, and then the how, and then the what. Okay. One of the things I wanted to set up right up this morning in terms of risk management is when you're looking at establishing a risk management program or framework or structure, there's 3 elements of that. The first one is looking at your risk management philosophy. Okay, so the inner ring is really looking at the heart and the idea and the concept of risk management, which really comes down to what we were talking last night about the why. What is this all about? What type of risk management are you after? And what's your driving force behind it? What are the concepts, the principles, the ideas, the philosophies? Okay, so that's in the middle circle. Then the next circle around that is looking at the risk management process. Okay, risk management is risk management, and there is a set process that you can apply to a whole range of different activities, tasks and functions. And one of the things I'd like to do is draw this line of risk management planning, okay? So at one end sits all your mental appreciation, on the run, quick risk assessment, and that's where you say, oh, well, I've been working in this field for 20 years, I can just kind of work out the risks and do an intuitive risk assessment. But as you walk down that line of risk management planning, you start to use more formal tools and techniques. Okay, so you might do a little bit of deliberate risk planning, or you might be really, really calculated and use lots of in-depth methods and techniques, etc. So that's that second ring, the actual process. And then the third is actually the practice area. So last night, what did we have on the outside? Yeah, the what. So actually looking at the practices, and this is where the tools, the techniques, the methods, the templates, all of that come into play. And it's interesting as I travel around and people say, okay, Kimberly, this is all good, but just how do I do it? What's the tool? What's the template? Have you got an example? So people are really wanting the practice bit in that. But what I'd say is before you cut and paste a practice or a template or a tool or a matrix, you actually need to come back to the fundamental principles of your philosophy and the idea around what it is you're trying to do. And then look at the process and the level of depth of application of whether or not you're interested in intuitive, planned or calculated. And then once you've got that, you can actually start looking at the tools and techniques, okay, and match them appropriately. All right, so that should provide a little bit of a foundation for us over the next session. Okay. Okay, Okay, so in this presentation, what I'd like to do is, as I mentioned, I want to start off at a high level and connecting the structure around risk management and where it fits. So I'm going to talk you through the relationship between corporate governance, risk management, and then the safety application. Then what I'd like to do is really dive into risk profiling and what it can offer from a business sense, an operational sense, and possibly even an industry sense. And then I'd like to leave you with some of these tips and traps. And as I was preparing this presentation, I thought, okay, what do you actually summarise and provide to people so that they can take it away and actually apply this? Because I guess you come to lots of different sessions and it's like, okay, that's a nice idea, sounds good, I agree with all of that, but how can I actually take that back to my organisation and apply it? So I'll run us through a couple of those things. Okay, so where do we start? One of the things that I really like doing is looking at the accountability and oversight in this area. So have you heard of the term oversight, having good oversight or good governance? Yep. Okay, so when we say we govern something well, what jumps to mind? So when we say we govern something well. Okay, you've got policy and audits. Yep, what else? If I say I've got good governance on something or I govern something well, what does it imply? I've got my finger on the pulse. I've got things in hand, I've got visibility of what's going on, but maybe not necessarily in the detail. And so when we look at this definition of governance, it says governance is the systems by which we direct and control the organisation. Okay, so governance is the systems by which we direct and control the organisation. So when we start looking at what are the components of that governance or that oversight, there's three different areas. One is the compliance aspect, and I'm sure you'd all agree that there's rules, regulations, legislations, codes of practice, standards, advisory circulars. We have all of these structures that are actually built into the way we operate in order to give some level of direction and control to our organisation and our activities. And the other day, Tony Kern put that up, didn't he, when he started to talk about, the history to, the profession and starting to look at, the master tradesman and then all of these different things about how the skills are developed. Then there was this line, and then he said regulation. Okay, so somewhere along the line, we've tried to standardise and look at the base practice. So the compliance element is definitely one part of how you direct and control the organisation. The next element here is looking at the assurance component. So when we're looking at governance, we've got the compliance, what you must have or have to have, and then we've got this element of assurance. Now, a couple of years ago, this was called audit. So what's the purpose of an audit? When we audit something, we're checking, we're reviewing it. So why would you actually review something or you'd check it? What are you trying to get? Beautiful. You're after confirmation that things are going correctly. So if I say I give you my assurance on something, you're looking for that confirmation. You're looking for an undertaking or a guarantee or a promise or some type of indication that things are working properly. And so that's one of the key components of governance. And then the third element of governance is actually the management of risk. Okay, so within any organisation, there's those things that are predictable, not necessarily predictable, and when you start looking at, well, where does safety or a safety management system fit within the aviation context? Well, we've got the governance of how we direct and control the organisation, we've got our compliance elements, we've got this element of checking and getting some level of confidence or assurance, and then we've got the management of risk. One of the key risk exposures that we want to manage within the aviation industry is what? Safety. Yep. Just as possibly managing the environmental implications or the security implications. But if we look at one of those key risk exposures being safety, what we do is we put those systems in place which direct and control the organisation in relation to that risk exposure. And so our safety management system is simply that structure that we put in place to manage that risk area within the business because of its significance to our operation and our undertaking. All right, so this whole diagram, this area of governance, I actually use quite often, and it helps put in perspective when people are talking about risk management. You can see what angle that they're coming from. Are they coming from the angle of compliance? We have to do this because the rules say so. Is it around trying to get assurance and knowledge and confirmation of how things are working? Or is it in that area of maybe the unknown, the different areas of managing the risk? So that's a concept that you can take away in that. Okay, the next concept I wanted to put forward is the integration with some of these levels. So at this high governance and oversight level, we've got these three things. We've got our compliance, our assurance, and our risk management part. And then the bottom layer that we have on this diagram, actually it should probably read the operations management, okay? So the running of the day-to-day routine activities that happen within your business, whether it's the flying operations, the maintenance engineering activities, the logistics, the supply chain, the air traffic control, whatever the activities are at that operational level. And so we've got the business side, we've got the operational side, and then in the middle, there's this area of change and growth that occurs. Whether or not it's introducing a new aircraft into service, maybe it's opening a new base, maybe it's negotiating a new contract with a client, an organisational restructure perhaps, introducing new technology into service like with night vision goggles, or some type of change or growth that you're actually wanting to put in place in order to expand your capability or get a greater return. So why is this important? Because when we look at each one of these levels, there's actually an element of risk management that actually sits within each of those. So at the governance level, the bit of risk management that we're talking about is enterprise or business risk management. So we'd look at all different aspects and all different dimensions. Within the area of change management, we've coined this phrase to do some venture risk management planning. So when I say that we're embarking upon a new venture, what does that conjure up? If we're embarking on a new endeavour or a new venture, something good. Yeah? No? Maybe? Okay, so if we're going on this new venture or this new endeavour, obviously we're doing it to get some level of gain, some level of efficiency, some level of expansion, or something that's better. And we would actually put all this stuff in place in order to get that outcome or that benefit. So the venture risk management planning is just the application of the risk management process to that key area of growth and change. Okay, and it's quite easy to then put the boundaries around that. And then at the operational level, that's where we're really looking at the application of risk management to your day-to-day routine activities. Okay, so the operational risk management part actually sits within the safety management system alongside some of the other elements there. Why is this important? Because I guess you can see that if we've got this smattering of risk management at that enterprise level in the governance component, within the areas of change and growth, and then at the operational level, one of the things is you can see that you can integrate the systems by which you direct and control the organisation through mastering the management of risk. Okay, with that. Make sense? All right, so if you're looking at developing your skill sets within your organisation of your people, and you can teach them the idea, that risk management philosophy of what it's about, and then they can learn the risk management process and the steps in that and look at its application, whether or not it's in that business context, whether it's in that project or change area, or whether or not it's at the operational area, you can see that you can start to then adapt and select the right level of practice and get the right tools and techniques to actually support you in that application. All right. Okay, so risk profiling, where does this sit? It was interesting, I was with Rob and Kevin from Trinity Helicopters the other night, and we were having a chat about the seminar and the forum and all these different sessions, and really what we were all learning out of that. And I said to Kevin, what is it that you really want to know about all this risk management stuff? He goes, Kimberly, there's just this language that's being used out there. There's all these words and terms and definitions. And I said, have you heard some of those before? And he goes, well, yeah, some of them I've heard. He goes, but there's quite a few new words in there. He goes, I really want to understand the language set. And so what I did is I ran away, got into this presentation. I went, I think we've just got to slot in some slides about, the fundamental basics of risk management 101, because it's easy to assume that we all just know the lexicon, we know the language, we've got the structure in our mind. And one of the things that I find really interesting in risk management is you can walk into any organisation and work with qualified, competent, excellent, credentialed people, And then you start talking to them about risk management, they totally glaze over and lose all their professional confidence and go, I don't know how to do that. I literally don't know how to do that. And you think, well, what do you mean? You know, you've got this experience, you've got the seniority, you've got the degrees, the masters, the licensing, the certification. And I thought, okay, well, we probably need to go back a little bit, not just assume that this is something intuitive, and there is an intuitive application, but when we start looking at that planned and calculated, particularly in that change management area or in the business risk, we can actually start to teach that a little bit better. So, with risk management, I thought I'll just take us back and go through a few fundamentals. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and I don't have full slides on this, so if you're interested, I'll slow down and you're welcome to take some notes. But I thought, let's actually just go back, and these were the 4 things that I thought were important to understand what they were. So I'll take you through risk, I'll take you through risk assessment, I'll take you through risk management, and then I'll show you what risk profiling is. Does that sound good? Because I think we actually use all these words interchangeably, and certainly from my perspective, when I started working in this field, you know, I wasn't a pilot, I wasn't an air traffic controller, I wasn't an engineer, I didn't have 20 years experience, but I think what I mastered and worked out was the idea of risk management made sense to me, but then I became a process facilitator because I thought, well, I can learn that process. And then when you team and partner with people with all that other experience, before you know it, you're actually in some pretty sophisticated areas of practice, but you're pulling on that expertise, but putting that into this structure. Okay, so that's something. All right, so risk, what is risk? If you're interested, you can write down this definition. Risk is the chance of something happening that could impact upon your objective. Okay, very simple. Risk is the chance of something happening that could impact upon your objective. So you'll see nothing about safety in there, you'll see nothing about an explosion at the front gate or doom and gloom. It's purely risk is the chance of something happening that could impact upon your objectives. All right, now what is safety risk? Well, risk is the chance of something happening that might impact on a safety objective. Okay, we've got this safety objective of 0 accidents, or maybe a 20% reduction in lost time injuries, or maybe an increase in the visibility of our safety reporting culture is something that we're after. So we can set these safety objectives or safety goals, and risk is the chance of something happening that could impact upon that. Or risk is the chance of a safety something happening that could impact on our objectives. Okay, so did you get that? Where you can insert the safety bit. Just like financial risk management, risk is the chance of something happening that could impact on a financial objective. Okay, we want to make a turnover, you know, profit margin of 22% this year. Okay, that's our objective. Well, risk is the chance of something happening that could impact on that. Okay, or risk is a chance of a financial thing happening that could impact on another objective. Okay, so you can insert that contextual setting, whether it's safety risk management, financial risk management, etc. Okay, so the thing that I really like about that risk thing is that link to objectives. And a lot of people miss that altogether. And I can see that in people's application of risk management, in risk registers and paperwork, where they have this list and this string of areas, and it's almost like they identify anything that could go wrong, okay? And you just get crazy stuff. And in my earlier days, when I first got started in risk management, I was working with the Australian military back at home, and it was really interesting. I sat down and after an accident that happened back in 1996, it was mandated that the guys needed to do a risk assessment every time they went flying. And so, you know, I was junior, I was in the Army Reserve, I used to spend my holidays at this unit. I think I was the only Army Reserve officer in the whole setup, and had the opportunity to work with the guys up in Townsville. And so we had CH-47s, we had the Iroquois, the UH-1s, and then we had the Black Hawks, so multiple different roles, and you know, quite a busy unit with that diversity of aircraft type. And it was really interesting. I went up to the commanding officer, and in one of my university breaks, there was a guy who was in the operations role, and I didn't really have a job. And so I went up to him and he goes, so young lady, how long are you here for? I went, well, sir, I'm here for a few weeks. He goes, what do you know about risk management? And I went, well, sir, I've done 2 subjects at university. Not really my favourite subjects. But I kind of went, well, you know, what do you need? He said, well, after the accident, it's been mandated that the guys have to do a risk assessment every time they go flying. He said, it's becoming a little bit much. You know, there's all this paperwork and bits and pieces. He said, can you go out and have a look at it and come back to me and tell me what you think? So I went, okay, sir, away I went. So I went and worked with the flying squadrons, and as you do when you're about 17 and you're an Army reservist and you're a girl and you're not a pilot and you're in this environment and you're sitting there, you go, okay, how do I do this? So literally what I did, I went and collected all these risk assessments that the guys had filled out, and I had over 1,000 of these risk profiles, all these risk assessments, and I sat back and I did some data crunching, and I thought I'll just write it up. And then on over 1,000 of these risk assessments, you know, I basically summarised it into 2 double-sided A4 bits of paper, and all the risks just summarised into 4 pages. And I thought, this is very interesting. The risks that the guys were putting down were things like birds, bats, wires, other aircraft on every single different, you know, mission type, from a 6-ship multi-role night vision goggle exercise on a counter-terrorism task, all the way through to an external load gun lift, you know, in a Chinook. And I thought, come on, there's got to be more risks than just these things: birds, bats, wires, other aircraft. And guess what the risk treatment strategies were that they put in place, like on their forms? Loadmaster to look out, air traffic control, and airmanship. I thought, oh, okay, well, isn't there a bit more complexity around that? And it was really interesting because, you know, as we started to, you know, roll through these practices and start looking at risks, I thought, well, what's your objective? What is it that you're actually trying to do, and where does that actually fit? And I think that's when I realised that you didn't need to repeat all the stuff that was already embedded into the mission planning, the doctrine, the training, the certification, the flight authorization process, you know, all of this type of stuff, because it didn't actually add value. And so we started to look at what was different, or what was that extra bit that was needed to actually really harness this risk management side of things. But what we found is, from that risk perspective, the guys had identified almost anything that could go wrong, either in such a basic way, or it was extreme. They'd have things like meteorite shower, you know, might hit the hangar, and you go, well, yeah, it could happen, you know. And so it went from the basic to the ridiculous, you know, in that. So that's important. All right, so if that is risk, what is risk management? Risk management is the culture, the processes, and the structures that we put in place in order to effectively manage opportunities while minimising adverse effects. Okay, so risk management, it's the culture, it's the processes, and the structures. What I've got for you up here on the board is the risk management process, so not the philosophy, but the process, that second ring. This has been taken out of the ISO, or the International Standard Organisation standard. It's ISO 31000. It was released in 2009, and it was the first international standard on risk management. However, in some countries around the world, including Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, the UK, a few others, this risk management process had been in a standard or written format from probably the late 90s. Okay, so probably 10 to 12 years prior to the release of this standard. Has anybody seen this one before? Yep, a couple of people. Okay, so this is the risk management process, and what I'd like to do is just draw your attention to a few different things. So what can we draw out of this diagram? Okay, the first thing is the first step, establishing the context. How much of your time when you're doing your risk management planning do you think you would spend in that step, just from a percentage perspective? Establishing the context. Anyone? Small amount, like 5%, 10%, 20%, maybe? Yep. Is that what we really spend, or what we should spend?
Probably what really spent.
Okay, yeah, what's really spent. Anyone else? Okay, when I do risk management planning, on average, I would spend 40% of my time in this step. Okay, so if the activity, task, or function that we're assessing is new and different, and we've never done it before, I could actually spend up to 60% of my time in establishing the context. Why do we do this? Because if risk is a chance of something happening that could impact on our objective, we want to know what it is, the boundaries, limitations, assessment of what it is we're actually assessing. And one of the things is, well, actually, what is the objective? What are we trying to do? Someone asked yesterday, Kimberly, what can you explain what's in this step of establishing the context? I went, oh, okay, there's probably about maybe 10 to 15 sub-steps that sit under there. Things such as identify what your objectives are, look at your boundaries and limitations, look at who's actually involved from a stakeholder perspective, write a description or a word picture of the scenario or the activity that you're actually looking at assessing. And it's really interesting. I was talking with a major company the other week at an air show, and we were talking about risk management and risk profiling. And one of the things when you're looking at how do you use risk management and where do you get the best value out of it, I've got this little saying: wherever there is change, there is risk, but wherever there's risk, there's opportunity. Okay, so sometimes people think risk is a bad thing, don't take it and run away. But actually, wherever there is change, there is risk, but wherever there's risk, there's opportunity and that upside. So if you're not sure where to apply risk management, look at your organisation and ask yourself the question, where are our key areas of growth and change in our organisation, okay, in the next year or two? And then that will actually start to give you some focus. And I was sitting down with this large organisation and they said, you know, we've got this challenge or this issue with our foreign military sales when we're selling aircraft and boats and ships and bits and pieces. That, you know, we've been doing this for years and years and years and years, but our risk profile in terms of our terms and conditions with our client base sometimes actually really restrict us. And at the end of the day, we know these customers, we know the clients, we've got a good working relationship, and at the end of the day, after 2 years worth of negotiation, we will probably, you know, agree to these different things, but we just delay the purchase of these assets or aircraft or bits and pieces. And they said maybe we could actually look at developing a risk profile around how we, you know, these challenges and risks associated with that. And so these people work in this organisation. This is their area all the time. I've just been introduced to them and I'm sitting there going, okay, I think I get the context. Okay, and then they're going, do you know what I mean? And I'm like, kind of. Can you just explain this a little bit more? And then, you know, really starting to flesh out that context, you probably need more than 30 minutes to actually understand the context of the situation in order to then effectively do some good risk planning on that situation. So what else would we need to know? We'd want to know, well, what are you trying to achieve? Can you describe the situation? How many customers are you talking? How does this foreign military sales stuff work? What is the process? Who's involved? Is this a legal thing? Is it a finance thing? Is it a customer service and sales thing? What countries are we actually talking? You know, and you start to actually flesh out this context to get those boundaries of the assessment. It's just like a description, okay, right up front. It's interesting when we've got a lot of experience in something, you can assume that the person that you're talking to just has that same level of depth of understanding. And if you're facilitating or you're writing the risk process, it's really up to you to establish the context, okay, and to pull it out of whoever you're talking to, and then go through this structured sequence, ask them the questions to try and put the boundaries around it, okay. It's really interesting from an operational perspective. You might say, yep, well, we do these activities and we've been flying this stuff for 30 years and the guys, it's all pretty routine and fairly stock standard, but it's interesting to actually start to put that contextual setting around that. So going back to this diagram, what are some of the things that we can pull out of this? The first thing is the importance of establishing that context. The second thing is, can you see the arrows on this diagram? Yep, just check it out for a second. Is there a start and an end? No. Okay, risk management is an iterative process. It keeps going around and around. Why? Risk is dynamic and it doesn't, you know, it's not stagnant. So in terms of your risk management, you'll see these arrows keep going around and around, and it's something that, you know, as you actually unpack risks and you put things in place, sometimes that can trigger other things, other times it can minimize. So things actually do keep changing. So the establishing the context is important. The next thing is this, the arrows and the iterative process. The next thing is, can you see this coffee-coloured box that says risk assessment that sits around a few of those steps? Okay, there is a difference between risk assessment and risk management. Risk assessment is the identification and quantification of risk, okay? Identify it and measure it. Whereas risk management then takes that information and starts to put it within a context. You then start prioritising it for action. You'll then do something about it, and implement some resources or something to reduce the risk. And then you've got this communicate and consultation and this monitor and review function, which are all these management methods and techniques. So there is a really big difference between risk assessment and risk management. And I certainly like to be quite disciplined in my selection of words. If I say I'm writing a risk assessment, I would very, very rarely do a risk assessment. But I would very, very often develop a risk management plan, okay, where we're looking at the whole situation, we're scoping it up, we're looking at the risks, we're identifying them, we're measuring them, but then we're actually saying, and this is what you can do about it to reduce it, and these are the resources you need to spend, and if you do this in 6 months, hopefully you'll achieve a reduction, and you need to go and brief this guy and tell this person and engage with this person, map it out, track it, come back and report it. So I would very rarely just do a risk assessment to identify and measure and leave it at that. Okay? However, if you work in the quantitative risk area, absolutely, you'd probably be doing some scientific modelling or, maybe using some of those techniques like Monte Carlo simulation or bow tie assessments and bits and pieces to actually really get to the heart of the identification and then the measurement, but then that information would go to someone so that they can do something about it. Okay, so there's just a couple of things, on that risk management process. So how do we actually walk through this? So you establish the context about 40% of your time. Then in your risk identification, there's different tools, methods and techniques that you can use to apply this process. So you know how we talk about the philosophy, the process and the practice? Well, risk identification, you can use a whole string of techniques. There's probably 20 or 30 different methods that you can use, from brainstorming to workshopping to looking at past data, looking at scenario planning. There's some of the qualitative methods. You could look at a whole stack of quantitative methods, etc. Then the next one is the analysis of risk. This is where we start to measure consequence and likelihood and calculate a risk level. Okay, so this is where some of our tools like a matrix might come in, or some type of descriptor set, or numbers and colours and charts. So all we're trying to do there is to just get some type of ranking or measurement in that. Then the risk evaluation is where you've got your list of risks, you've measured it, and then you're trying to prioritise it from highest to lowest in order to rank and compare so you can then act and treat these risks. The risk treatment is all about the risk reduction. I very rarely use the word risk mitigation because I think for me, risk mitigation implies that you remove and get rid of it altogether. And it's very much a workplace health and safety term, which in that context we do want to remove, eliminate and mitigate risk. But within aviation, I guess, being a realist, you're never going to get rid of risk. But what we actually want to do is reduce it. So this selection of the word risk treatment is all about treat it, do something about it in order to reduce. And then we've got this monitor and review function and that communicate and consult, which you can see at every step of the way. All right. So going back to some of our fundamentals, we've talked about risk. Risk is a chance of something happening that can impact upon our objective. We've talked about risk assessment, which is actually the identification and measurement of risk. And then we've talked about risk management, which is then taking that information and framing it up, making a decision about it, prioritising it for action, and kind of getting it on your radar and reviewing things on that regular basis. So if that's what all of that is, what is a risk profile? Now, it was interesting, for me, I think a risk profile is actually a picture or a summary of the risk. Now, if you're doing your work and you're doing your risk assessment or your risk management planning, there's actually a lot of information and data in that. So if you're introducing, say, the new AW139 into service within your organisation, and the guys have spent years coming up with the project plans and the transition plans and the new training regime and updating operations manuals and looking at all these change and growth, there's going to be a stack load of paperwork, wouldn't you think, that actually has gone into that planning cycle? Yep. Okay, so where would the use of a risk profile come in? Well, if you're presenting that information in order to get engagement, buy-in, a decision on resourcing, some type of support for that change, or maybe it's just about providing some level of assurance that you've got something in check, that level of confidence or confirmation, you could take that mountain of paperwork and present it at the board of directors level, or you could present it to the boss, or you could go and present it to the customers. It's a lot to digest. Would you agree? Yep. Okay, so the profiling comes into providing a summary or a picture that sits over the top. Now, you can do your risk profiling if you've got that depth of stuff that sits underneath it. Okay? So, when we start looking at a risk profile and what is it, I thought, okay, I'll just go to the thesaurus and I'll check out what these words mean. So, you know, if we're looking at a profile, what is a profile? It says here a profile is a picture. It's a summary, it's a synopsis, it's a précis, it's a rundown, it's a sketch, it's an outline. Okay, so if we've got that in our mind and we're saying, okay, we're going to be doing some risk profiling, chances are what we're doing is we're writing up a summary or a picture of some description, okay, in order to what? Communicate the risk situation, in order to do what? Get an outcome, a decision, some type of intervention, or the provision of assurance. Sound good? Okay, so who here now thinks that they do risk profiling? Who here would maybe do risk management planning or do risk assessments? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so it really comes down to, isn't it funny, in business, in life, in management, we're really targeted with our audience when we're doing project plans and business plans and strategic plans, and we're very focused as to who's our audience, what are we trying to communicate, what's the outcome that we need. But then for some reason in the game of risk management, we do all this, you know, crazy work and all this paperwork and bits and pieces, and then we go and take all these working notes and try and present it and wonder why the non-aviator board member on our board of directors doesn't approve stuff. Okay. So, if on the panel on Monday, I talked about the subtle changes in risk management versus the use of the management of risk. And the chairman of that ISO Standards Committee, Kevin Knight, has been a lovely mentor of mine since the late 90s. Kevin Knight, he is an Aussie guy, and he actually was responsible for setting up that International Standards Committee. And it's really interesting, when you listen to Kevin speak, he very, very rarely uses the word risk management. He is very deliberate and he always talks about the management of risk. And I said, why is that? He goes, Kimberly, it's a management discipline. Risk management is actually a management discipline. We're just applying the management discipline around risk. Okay? So he said if people can master that it's about the management of risk, it puts the focus in the right area about good planning, good decision making, good communication. And he said, and if that happens, all this other stuff falls into place about getting the right format, the right tools and techniques. Because if people are applying management principles, they do understand who their audience is. They do understand the decision that's meant to be made. They do understand that there's a planning process and resource allocation that's needed to bring about that change. And there is a monitoring and review function, and there is a checking function and a reporting function and documentation. You shouldn't need to convince them otherwise. I thought, oh, that actually makes sense. All right, so with this risk profiling, if we've talked through that and that's what it is, what are the different levels of risk profiling that we can use within our organisation? Okay, there's three different levels here, and these should be all fairly comfortable for you. We've got an industry level. So do we have anyone that works for a regulator here? Transport Canada or one of the other regulators? No? Okay. But if you're a regulator and you're responsible for having oversight of an industry or a sector, you would probably want to understand the risk synopsis, picture, or précis of that industry sector, would you not? Yep. Okay, so we've got industry level profiling, which really is around having oversight of a different sector or industry. How would you actually use that profiling? You would use it to direct your surveillance effort, your intervention, where your inspectors spend your time. Maybe you would actually look at where you put your time into regulatory and rule development, maybe sector-specific safety initiatives, and things that you might target. So you would use that profile to direct your resource planning, your surveillance, your auditing, your inspector's effort, and actually maybe prioritise, do I look at this sector? Do I look at the flight training schools over the agricultural aviation sector? Do I look at the charter over the airline sector? Do I look at the airspace management over sport and recreational aviation of hot air ballooning and warbirds? I don't know, I need oversight of all of it, but how do I rank and prioritise where I put my effort? You know, when we've got a set amount of resources. So we've got the industry level of profiling used in the regulatory space. Then we step into area of our control. Okay, you can do organisational risk profiling, which is really on your business. Okay, so you're looking at the risk profile on your organisation or your company, and we all come from really different companies in different countries, different sizes, small, medium and large. Some of us do really diverse, activities. Others of us are narrow and just do one thing. Some of us have a structure and we're pseudo-government. Others are privately owned. Some are owned and listed on the stock exchange. But we've got these different organisational profiles, and so we can actually look at the risk profiling in the organisational level. And the last area is in the operations area, okay? So we can do profiling on our activities, tasks and functions at the operational level. And I guess this is the area that most of us are quite comfortable with, particularly if that's your background and your grounding and you've been a pilot or an engineer or an air traffic controller or a maintenance guy or a logistics person. Those activities at the operational level are quite comfortable for us. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just start at the operational level because that is something that's familiar to us. So what are the tips of how you actually set up risk profiling at the operational sense? Now, it's really interesting looking at an organisation as to who actually defines and is quite clear and can pick something up that actually defines their scope of operational task profiles, not risk profiles, they're operational task profiles. Who here could actually provide me with a list that's already a working document within their organisation that actually maps out the different task profiles that you would, activity task profiles that you'd have within your organisation?
It's very hard to do.
It's hard to do?
It's so dynamic. You use so many different things as a helicopter operator.
Okay. So it's tricky to define? Yep.
There's a lot of variables.
I agree with you on the variables. In terms of the scope, and this is part of, I guess, the art of setting up your framework or your structure for profiling. Is one of the first things is actually to get that definition in place. And it's interesting. I used the example the other day about doing some work up north here in Canada with one of the helicopter operators, and I was just amazed at their diversity of task profiles. They did everything from, pipeline work through to power line stuff, through to wildlife management, through to search and rescue, through to, supporting the mines and doing external loads and moving drill bits and things around the place. And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't think I've ever worked with an organisation that's got such a diversity of what they do, and a helicopter. Yeah, absolutely. Then diversity within each one of those tasks. And it was funny, I thought, wow, in 10 years of our experience when we started working with them, I thought, yep, we've got experience over most of those areas, but it's actually been with different companies. So, yep, we've done power line work, but with a power line company, and we've done some wildlife stuff with some agricultural guys, and then we've done some search and rescue with Coast Guard or the military, or emergency response with an aeromedical operator, and I thought, oh, this is like 50 companies in one, that's got all of that. And then you're right, within each one of those tasks, there is diversity. However, I don't believe it's impossible, and I actually don't think it's a difficult task to map this out. It actually just takes a little bit of brain power and then some decision making about really where you want to put the scope and the boundaries of your application. We were recently working with a Department of Agriculture, and they contract aviation services. So I think they had about 17 to 20 helicopter and fixed wing operators that they would engage, a lot for campaign flying and kind of seasonal work. And they actually had a helicopter accident, and it wasn't fatal, but one of their staff members was in the back of one of their contracted aircraft. And so I think it was this real wake-up call for these scientists and agricultural people that went, oh, aviation's actually quite risky. And do we actually know the risks of these activities? And they said, well, these guys, the pilot's got a license, they've got an AOC, the regulator checks them. Don't they check all of this stuff? And when I kind of explained, well, this is the certificate license that they operate under, and here's the minimum standard, they're amazed that there was not the level of detail around the particular task profiles that they flew. And so when we actually sat down with them and said, what do you do? They said, okay, well, we start to do this work and this work and this work. And it's really interesting. They said, we do seagrass monitoring. And I went, Okay, what's seagrass monitoring? Has anyone here ever done seagrass monitoring? No, okay, good. I wasn't the only one that went, that's very good. I've been around aviation for a while, I don't know what you mean. So seagrass monitoring, so you know, it's almost like a marine biology type of surveillance that they will do on seagrass in the ocean and, you know, bits and pieces. So because they're agricultural things, they will go out to look at, you know, the different plant life and this and that and how it all works. But they will contract helicopters to take their ag guys out to go and inspect how it's growing and moving and changing and this and that for their marine biology. I thought, oh, okay. And so you start going, all right, well, that's one activity that you do. And then they do fire ant monitoring. Anyone know what that is? Yep, okay. So all these different activities. Now, it was really interesting. When we started to map that out, they had probably about 20 different task profiles that they would use. Now, some of them would just be very occasional and they wouldn't do regularly and it would just be on call. Other stuff would actually churn up maybe 40 to 50% of their dollars and their flying hours, and they do it all the time. Okay. But I tell you what, it wasn't too hard an exercise to sit down with them and actually map that out. And once we mapped that out, we were able to develop an application map and say, okay, these are your 20 activities and profiles that you do. Then you can actually start putting the structures in place to say, okay, well, how are we going to identify, quantify, and manage the risk with each of those task profiles? Do we build it into the procedures? Do we leave it with the aviation operator? Or do we actually want to restrict and control some of the activities that we do in order to minimise the risk? It's actually a really, really good exercise. And I would say this is something that, although we've got SOPs, manuals, lots of structures, manufacturer's guides, etc., this is actually a fairly straightforward and easy task that you can put in place to bring clarity to your people around the scope of your operation. Now, this doesn't mean if you write that you've got 20 profiles and you get a job to do something else, it doesn't mean that you can't do it, okay? It just really shows the scope of your oversight, the scope of your application. So going back to risk profiling of how you use this at an operational level, the first thing that we're looking at is operational risk profiling is around your routine, standard, business as usual activities, okay? What is normal? Now, if I was overseeing an aviation company and say I was overseeing it for maybe a 5 to 10 year period, one of the things I'd be really interested in is how has our area of focus and effort shifted over the time, and maybe we started off doing this type of work and now we're doing this type of work. Yep. It doesn't mean you can't change, and it doesn't mean you can't go where the work is and change with your client's expectation, but what it does mean is if you started off doing this and then it shifts over time to that, what does that mean for your organisation? Your training, your procedures, your recruitment, your oversight, your supervision that was all set up for this system, and then you've shifted to this, you probably want to make sure that that has adapted in order to deliver the protection and the risk treatment strategies. Part of that is looking at the operational risk profiling and the operational profiling and starting to look at that. Once you've got the definitions of your standard task profiles, whether it's in any of your operational areas, the idea of risk profiling is to trend and monitor the shift in the profile. Okay? So rather than sit back 10 years later and go, oh, we set up our organisation to do combat search and rescue, but actually now we do Medivac and Casivac. If you're doing your risk profiling, you should be monitoring the trends and the shifts on a regular, routine basis. And this is an area I would say I haven't really seen anyone at this stage really master this from an oversight perspective. I have seen people master it from a practice level where they've got good task profiles and operational profiles, and the crews are using it and it's built into all the processes. But then to actually do that summary and trending that sits over the top in order to deliver on your oversight or your assurance area, I think that's actually, has a lot of value. And personally, I don't think it's a lot of work to pull together because the data's actually already there. Okay, it's just looking at that. Is it a break? So the question was, is it a breakdown in the, you know?
Because, you know, as a police officer, I look at a situation
Yep.
and I reassess all the time
Yep.
what level I need to go to.
Yep.
Come back again.
Yep.
And for us in this, we look at stuff, we make changes, we'll change our SOPs,
Yep.
training program and stuff, try
To counterbalance. Yeah. Yep.
so that we don't find ourselves in that.
Yeah, in that situation. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it is part of that. And I put this slide up the other day, and I think you're absolutely right. It's like you identify these things and you change, and then you adapt as you go. It's actually whether or not it's conscious or unconscious. Now, if you're the guy who's actually really updating the procedures, it's very conscious for you because you're doing an amendment change and you're making a decision, you're writing that. But for the whole rest of the organisation that maybe isn't in that doing part, is it conscious? Well, the amendment came out, I noted it, and that's great. But actually, has there been a consciousness that they've shifted? Possibly not. You know, we get that scope creep all the time, don't we? And I guess part of that is building experience. Okay, you do that 3 times, you build the experience, next time you know not to look for it, and then that's where you put an old head on young shoulders and you try and, you know, impart that wisdom and that knowledge intuitively. I guess what we're talking about, if we're looking at governance and oversight and having systems by which we direct and control the organisation, then really all we're saying is we're putting a bit more formal structure around that so it's conscious. And it's really amazing with this stuff. When you can bring that level of consciousness and insight, the awareness just totally changes and people's behaviour changes if you're aware. And yeah. Shift. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then part of it as a manager is that continuous circle.
Yep.
I made the input, what's the reaction?
That's right.
Adjust the input, get another reaction.
That's it.
And it's continue on.
Well, you know what's really interesting is, hang on, where is it? This. Remember the arrows? They continually go around, okay? Yeah, you don't start and stop and then it's done, unless you're stagnant and you don't change, which is what we were saying. You know, my organisation's dynamic. Every situation is different. There's so many variables. But certainly you can put some boundaries, you know, around those variables. You don't need to predict every scenario and every situation. And I think, have you heard of risk-based regulation and risk-based rulemaking, goal-based stuff? So there's this big shift with all the regulators around the world over the last few years where they're moving to this. So what is that all about? Well, they've sat back and said, you know what? Rather than try and prescribe every single practice, you know, in that outer ring for every single sector, every scenario, every aircraft type, every, variable under the sun, and putting a rule in place to try and manage that risk, that's just so crazy. We can't possibly, our span of control is just too big to be able to do that. If we can take a step back and actually be confident that people have a process by which they manage, direct, identify, well then we can get our level of assurance that they can be best positioned for success when it comes to those variables and different things. Okay, so I guess we've seen this swing from prescriptive-based rulemaking, you know, of putting every scenario in there and having a compliance-based inspector that comes out and checks you off and gives you a ticket, through to actually we're going to identify the application of your process and evaluate your thinking and your logic and your structures of how you direct and control your organisation, so we'll check the process. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is you have a think about the traits and characteristics and the skills that you would need to do prescriptive-based auditing and, you know, rulemaking. It's quite easy. You need somebody who's quite methodical and, you know, maybe with those skill sets of that police or inspector that just takes the rules and they're really a stickler for that, and you're actually compliant or you're not compliant. Whereas if you're looking at someone that can go in and evaluate the application of a process, it's quite a different skill set, isn't it? Okay, so one of the things is I think we need to be a little bit tolerant and patient with this transition period that we're in at the moment, because we're all very critical of our regulators, aren't we? You know, the inspector's come out and he's done this and this and this and this, and they don't understand and they're not on top of this. But actually, what's happening internally within the regulators all around the world is they're almost trying to shift their workforce from rule-based compliance checking into process-based evaluation, and it's a totally different skill set, and there really is a transition that's happening. But guess what? We're doing within our organisations the same thing, okay? We're saying, yep, we don't want to stifle every single situation, but if you can adopt, what do you think safety management systems is about? Okay? Safety management systems is about having a process of how you identify and manage risk. That's it. You know, it's looking at the proactive and the reactive and combining it together into an accountability framework to make effective decisions. It's about moving information. It's all around that process-based stuff so that you can be empowered to work across the spectrum of your activities that you do in that. Okay, so going back to this level of risk profiling, in this operational application, the whole idea with risk profiling is to look at the trends of the profile and the changes to the normal so that you can see when you're actually shifting. And there is a very, very strong linkage with your existing supporting processes, whether they're SOPs, training, your experience, your licensing, your definition, and that's really where this comes into play. And one of the things that's interesting in this, when people are looking at risk management planning, this might be a little bit difficult to see, but when you've got this and you're looking at, well, how much is enough, it depends where your activity, task or function sits within that spectrum. So if it's something new and different, okay, so looking at this, if it's new and different and it sits up here, you've never done it before, you've got this really big gap in existing supporting processes. Okay, maybe you don't have SOPs, maybe you don't have checklists, maybe you don't have that structure, but that's where you can use the risk management process to walk you through the context, the identification, the assessment, the treatment strategies, and guess what? Those risk treatment strategies then can be pseudo procedures or structures that you can put in place to manage that type of profile. However, if you've got a routine activity at the operational level that you do all the time and it's really built into the, the setup and the structures that you've got with the guys, and giving them the flexibility to apply their experience and their airmanship and their judgment within the boundaries of what you've set up, really you're relying on all of this type of existing supporting processes, so there's only that extra little bit of risk management that might be needed. And so what is that little bit? Well, maybe in that operational setting, it's just having a consciousness. Okay, so how do you trigger that awareness and the consciousness? Well, it might just be in the pre-flight briefing that you put a trigger in there, you design the system so that they stop and they think about it and have a discussion. Okay, it might just be that in your shift handover brief that there's some type of discussion. Or you might formalise it and actually start building it into other things. Okay, so let's move on to the organisational application of risk profiling. What's this all about? Okay, this is actually about looking at your business. It's about looking at the risks across all different risk areas, whether it's safety, security, environment, finance, capability, reputation, legal risk, all of those, and actually looking at the risks associated with that. Now, for any of you that have worked in the business risk management space, again, you use a structure, but you generally use the structure of your departments or your organisation, and it's linked back to your business plan. So if risk is a chance of something happening that could impact on your objective, most businesses, in a formal sense or maybe intuitive, would have some type of goal or objective. Would you agree? Okay, whether you write it down or maybe update those plans, I think all of us do different planning cycles, some more disciplined than others, but at the end of the day, there is a business objective or an outcome that you want to achieve. And so what we're looking at in this organisational risk profiling is the risk associated with that. So like the operational side, we're looking at those trends or summaries in risk for the business, but generally an enterprise risk program would have departmental risk registers or looking across the different business units, and they'd look at the risks associated with the business and delivering the business plan. Now, many of you would just do business as usual, and some departments year in, year out would have exactly the same budget, exactly the same structures, exactly the same activities, exactly the same outcome, and that's fine. However, others might have a lot of change and growth, and they're driving initiatives, projects, implementation, etc. So even just in that, you could assume that those departments or those business units that are fairly routine probably wouldn't have too much of a shift or a change in their risk profile. But those that have got a lot going on, their profile might go up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay, why is this important? Because wherever there is change, there is risk, but wherever there's risk, there's opportunity. One of the things within a business setting is looking at the cumulative impact of risk. And I don't know about you, but certainly with Aerosafe and me running our organisation, isn't it funny when you start taking on all these different things at the same time, you get to the point where your capacity is a bit maxed out and you start losing it. You know, and it's generally when you've taken on too much change all at the same time, which can be fantastic from an entrepreneurial and growth perspective, but sometimes it's just that bit too much risk, and it's when it all happens at the same time that you kind of get a bit wobbly, you know, of how you direct and control the organisation. And so sometimes, and it just depends on what type of organisation you are, what phase you're going through, whether you're a startup, whether you're going through a merger and acquisition, whether or not you're going through a growth stage, or whether or not you're plateauing and just trying to restabilise and positioning for that next phase of growth. Okay, so in terms of your organisational risk profiling, that's ultimately what it's about. It's about having a look at that picture of what's going on from a business risk perspective. It's very much linked with your strategic and business planning. Okay, that's where you derive your objectives. It does need to be cognizant of your operational activities and whether or not they're fairly routine or whether they're so dynamic that actually they are hard to predict, and maybe your job is actually just that, is to be responsive to any inquiry, any request that might come in, and maybe that's your business model, and that's fine. But you wouldn't necessarily want to be that if you've chosen to be something else, or like operating in that space if actually your business model is this. Okay, so that's where you can put things at risk. The various management systems, whether it's safety management systems, whether it's risk management, whether it's financial management, project management, all of those management systems are actually part of this construct. Why? If risk management is the culture, the processes and the structures that are directed towards the effective management of opportunities while minimising adverse effects, within a business, we've got lots of these management processes and structures that are there in place to help counterbalance that. Okay. One of the other things, I'm not sure if a few of you have sat in on Dave Downey's presentation, but he's delivering a session here around really how does your recruitment and hiring process actually link in with your oversight and your assurance program within your organisation? And he's really gone into the detail of, you know, how you can, recruit people with their strengths and the profile. That little piece actually can click in beautifully into your organisational risk profiling, because people are at the heart of our business, aren't they? And isn't it amazing how you can recruit and change one person and it can flip the whole dynamics of your business? And I find this really, really intriguing with the implementation of safety management systems. I actually think the level of effectiveness of how well that is done is directly related to the personality and the style of the leader. And I can see it. Like, we work in a program called the Aviation Safety Network, and there's multiple organisations in the US, Canada and Australia that have been on this journey of ongoing implementation and facilitated change processes, doing governance, risk management, safety management systems. And it's really interesting to watch how the personality and style of the CEO affects and influences the team. So if you've got a CEO or a boss that's mega conservative and quite compliance orientated and really quite deliberate in their planning, the team itself can do all this work and then stop and start and stop and start, and maybe it doesn't necessarily kind of move very fast because of that conservative construct. It's not a bad thing, it just is the way that it is. You might have someone else that's really innovative and dynamic with ADD, and they go to conferences and get all these great initiatives, and their team are just constantly on the boil. And maybe the byproduct of that is they don't finish things off properly, right? So they'll do a bit of this and a bit of that, and they've got this going and that going. But the good thing from that is everyone's engaged, everyone's involved, there's a high level of consciousness, but maybe things aren't completed. like it doesn't really matter what it is, but it's actually interesting to reflect if you're in that leadership role as to your own personal style and how that might actually impact on the profile of the implementation of some of these systems. And that's what Dave covers in his, is looking at some of the strengths, your strengths, not your personality profile, but your strengths and the way you operate, and how you can actually counterbalance some of that or leverage off that to really bring about the change. Okay, I'm just going to step into, and I put this up the other day as well about, how do you get the cultural side? On the organisational risk profiling, ultimately we want to get to a stage where this stuff happens intuitively and people just do it, and regardless of whether you're looking, regardless of whether or not you're in the office, you get consistency of behaviour, in that. And I guess for those of you that run, multinational organisations with helicopters all around the globe, whether they're in Papua New Guinea or in Brazil, or, whether they're in the UK or Australia, one of the things that, we've heard a lot about is trying to get consistency of that practice, across these cultural challenges. And it's really hard to do. It is really, really hard to do. But ultimately, that's what this diagram's about. You can create that environment, through your structures, your processes, your leadership, your organisational systems that can influence people's behaviour. Sometimes you can force or manipulate, but ultimately influence, which will in turn, if people buy into it, influence and affect the culture. Okay, so let's just look at that industry profiling. We've looked at the operational, we've looked at the organisational, and now looking at the industry level profiling. Basically, it's the same application, okay? An industry risk profile is reliant on having that risk assessment or risk management plan done, but unlike doing it on an operational task or on a company at an organisational level, it's just the application of risk management on a sector or an industry, okay, in itself. So what's one of the first things that you need to do? You need to define the industry. And it was really interesting. I sat down quite a few years ago, I think back in 2008, with the Deputy Director of CASA, and they had had an accident in the parachute industry. And we got a phone call, and next thing I'm sitting there with the Deputy Director, and he goes, "Kimberly, we've got this issue. We'd really like some help on doing a risk assessment on the parachute industry in Australia." And I said, "Okay, that sounds great. Sounds like it's right up our alley." And then I started to ask questions to establish the context. What's the first question you'd ask? Well, how big is this industry? Like, I don't know, I've done a parachute jump, but I didn't have visibility of the whole industry. I just kind of went on the day and strapped onto, a guy and jumped out with my tandem jump, $100, and away I went. But I thought, okay, well, how big is this industry? And his response was, well, we don't know. I said, well, how many aircraft are we talking? I'm just trying to get scope, right? I said, how many aircraft? He goes, we don't know. I said, well, how many pilots? He goes, no, Kimberly, that's the issue. In terms of our scope and oversight, because they're under a self-administration regime, they're not under an AOC licensing, he goes, well, actually, that's delegated, and that's not something that we actually track and trend. I thought, okay, well, if we're going to do the risk management side and the risk assessment, what's the first thing we need to do? Go out and define it. So guess what we did? We went out and we defined it. And at the end of it, when we worked out there was 70 operators, and we actually did some data collection about the type of aircraft that they flew and the number of pilots and the number of locations, their task profiles. It was amazing when we then started looking at the changes in that industry and the shift in activity profile. Guess what? Years and years ago, they started off as an industry of sport, okay, with parachute jumpers, maybe like 2,000 people who would do, competition, lots and lots of stuff. Guess what? 20 years on, guess what the profile of the industry is? It's a tourism industry making money with over 1 million tandem jumpers a year. Hey, that's a bit of a shift, isn't it? Okay, so if you were monitoring from an oversight perspective from an industry, it's gone from a recreational sport industry with a pretty low exposure of, say, 2,000 people with their profile that they jump all the time. Okay, so go back to this. If you jump all the time, one could assume you're sitting where on that spectrum? probably to the right. Even if it's not formal and documented in your SOPs, it's going to be that routine that they do it the same way most of the time anyway. Okay, so it's on that experience base. But then if you're a tandem jumper and maybe English is your second language and you're a Japanese tourist and you pay your $200 up in Cairns in North Queensland, that is a totally different profile, isn't it? So where would that sit on this spectrum of parachute jumping? Okay, down here. So it's really interesting when we start looking at that. And so we applied that risk management process diagram that you saw before. The first thing we did is we established the context, size, shape, scope of the industry, information, it's all there. Once we did that, then we could look at the risks associated with that sector. And once you start looking at the risks and the causes and the impacts and all of that, then you can actually be extremely targeted with your safety initiatives, with the question over whether or not the current regulatory regime of self-administration is appropriate, okay, given the shift in profile. And isn't that interesting? That is just one little subsector in aviation. That's not even Part 121 guys or charter operators or helicopter operators with the diversity of everything from offshore oil to this to that to that. And so what is an industry risk profile? An industry risk profile presents a strategic risk picture or a synopsis or an outline or a précis of those issues that induce risk at the systematic or structural level at an industry at a given point in time. Okay, so normally these risk profiles you would update maybe on a 2 to 3 year basis, or if there's a huge shift in the industry. So maybe you have a resource boom in the mining sector and all aviation goes crazy and fly-in, fly-out operations just go through the roof. Or maybe there's a bit of an offshore oil, boom, and before we know it, we've got another 50 helicopters in the area, and so that might be a significant shift. But generally, you would just reassess on that basis. Okay, this one's a little bit tricky to see, but what this industry risk profiling model does, it just provides a little bit of structure to present that synopsis or the picture, so that the risk information is then presented in a format, whether or not it's looking at the oversight and the compliance aspects, whether it's looking at the operator profile, whether it's looking at that activity profile and that shift from, as we use that example in the parachute industry, from sport jumpers through to the tourism industry. Looking at the actual aircraft and technology profile down the bottom, the industry operating environment, what is actually going on outside the actual aviation operators? With the air medical industry in the States, that is where the Medicare and Medicaid stuff comes in. That's where, the state EMS bodies come into play. They're kind of outside the jurisdiction of the actual aviation regulator, but they impact on that industry and they shape and they drive that industry in terms of the requirements. So that's considered there. The passenger and participant profile and how that might change. Whether or not you've got offshore oil workers in the back of your aircraft, or whether or not they're your employees, or maybe you're the RCMP and you're taking other people in the back of your aircraft that aren't necessarily employees, And so just looking at that passenger and participant profile really does change the industry profile. And then our systems, and then obviously our safety profile. So I just wanted to show you, in terms of risk profiling, if we've got the monster risk assessment and risk management plan that sits beneath it, then really what we're looking at is just that summary that sits above it. So I thought I'd just flick you through a few examples of risk profiles, okay, and the picture that might sit above it. Now this is the results of one we did for the US Air Force. You know how I was saying there's 12 service core functions or 12 capability areas? One is personnel recovery. Under personnel recovery, they've got the HC-130s, they've got the HH-60s or the Pave Hawk helicopters, and then they've got the PJs or the rescue para guys, the real cool suited up pseudo special forces people that the guardian angels that will come in and actually do the task itself. And so this was actually really interesting. We were able to do the risk management plan on each of those and then actually profile it. And then this is what the profile of that capability area looks like. Okay, so when we put that up, what actually jumps to mind? What does that focus your attention? You start looking at the reds? Yep, you start looking at the comparison and you start going, okay, I want to know what are those items up the top. Okay, so this profile will actually just give you a picture in order to then shape where you look. Okay. One of the other questions that you might start asking is, okay, that looks pretty good, but are there actually common issues across all three platforms. Okay, so maybe one of the risks is at the top for one of them and then at the bottom of the other, but you might want to fix those systemic things that go across all three. Okay. Now, it was interesting, about 6 to 12 months after we did the original assessment on the helicopters in the middle, we actually did the other two profiles and we reassessed. And did you see that? A little bit of a shift in profile. So over that 6 to 12 month period, we achieved a 17% risk reduction, measurable risk reduction, when we went back and reassessed the risk. How did we do that? We looked at the implementation of the risk reduction measures and whether or not they had been effective and whether they had been implemented. Okay, now it's really interesting when you start presenting these profiles and you say, okay, this is the picture that you've got. I have seen very senior people in the regulatory space, in the military space, in the commercial space, see the profile without any risk training whatsoever, turn around and direct the level of risk reduction like that. Almost guaranteed each time. Okay, that's good. I want to achieve a 40% risk reduction within the next 2 years. Tell me how much it's going to cost. Like, that is phenomenal when you get that level of direction, and then come back and report to me, and I want to embed this into our board reporting or into our safety board or into our such and such, and come back and tell me how we are tracking. Yeah.
So when you did the first part and then you went to the second part to see noticeable change, were you able then to review it and fine-tune it and get more change again?
Yeah, absolutely. And see, when you go back and reassess, there'll be new risks, and there'll be some that will just drop off the list because they're not relevant anymore or the context has shifted. And so that's really, and then you just need to ask yourself, how often do you reassess? Because sometimes you might do it on a 6-monthly or a 12-monthly basis and actually you don't see a shift. And it was interesting, it all comes down to your level of pace of implementation and things there as well.
You said a 17% reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Was that measured by a 17% reduction in accident rates, in instances?
Okay, so that's a really good question, because with risk is a chance of something happening that would impact on your objective. One of the measures is safety, but actually in risk profiling we don't necessarily use safety as the measure. It's actually a consequence or an impact of the risks being realised. And I think, you've seen that iceberg model before where, you might have an accident, but underneath it there's multiple incidents and near misses and bits and pieces. One of the things that we're trying to do in this type of work is actually look at the holes in the Swiss cheese and measure those and get the confidence around that, as opposed to an event. Because I think an event can be right at that top of that iceberg and can kind of give a little bit of a false confidence sometimes, because if nothing goes wrong, you think you're free of risk, but you're not. Okay? So this is where there's a real differentiation between safety and risk. And risk is a little bit not tangible, but it's the chance. But if you can quantify that exposure of where those holes are, I tell you what, if it was my business and you presented a picture to me that was data-driven, that was well-researched, that was well-documented, and you said, Kimberly, here are the holes in your business, vulnerabilities. It's holding out at the moment, that's great. But I tell you what, if you're to put your foot on the accelerator with your growth and expansion, these little holes might actually go like this, and you could almost predict when you're going to collapse. Like, does that make sense? So it just comes down to your confidence or overconfidence as to whether or not you're going to be gung-ho and take that risk, or whether or not you want the confidence to say, I want something a bit more reliable, because where I'd like to go is to really accelerate the business, and if they're the vulnerabilities, then I'm going to work on those in order to set ourselves up for success. Yeah, so it is a really interesting area. Okay, here's another diagram or a way to present this information. So we did, how's this, right? So we've been doing risk profiling in the aviation industry for the last probably 6 to 8 years. We've been doing risk management for years, but this profiling of putting the picture probably for the last six to 7 years. We've just had our first application in the naval environment, in the maritime environment, in the military. So rather than doing C-130s and paid for helicopters, we did them on the ships. And it was really interesting. So what we did is, you saw this model before, the industry risk profiling model. What we did is we presented the risk information against that structure, the reason we do that is the audience that you're presenting to have different responsibilities for those different areas. Some of them are interested in the operational side, some are interested in oversight, particularly the more senior you go. Their job is to direct and control the organisation and have governance and oversight. So if you're showing risks in the governance area, it hits home that it's in your portfolio, fairly easily. And so one of the things that, this is called an SRAP model, it's the Sector Risk Assessment Profile, and what we've got is down one axis, we've got all those elements of the model, and then on the other, we've got the accountability and area. So we're actually allocating the different risks in that profile. And so this is really interesting because you might see the CN, which is the Chief of Navy, has one risk. Don't know if you can see this. So he's got one risk in the external environment, and then he's got one in the oversight model, and then you can actually use this to navigate your way around the actual document, the risk management plan itself. So it's actually quite interesting. Now that's the current risk profile, and then that is the forecast risk reduction, and there's actually a list of jobs that go with that to say if you implement all these things, we have a certain level of certainty that you'll be able to reduce the risk to this, and here's the backing and the evidence and justification for it. So my question would be, how long is that going to take and how much it's going to cost, and how can we allocate those jobs to people? Okay, so you can actually track it. So just, it's a pictorial diagram for that. Here's another one. Some of you might have seen this before. It's called like a heat map. I could never really read these things before, and then one of the guys we were working for went, I just want to present it in that fashion. I went, okay, we'll just kind of come up with that concept. And so again, you can see, where the risks lie. And so on the inner circle, it's kind of the lower risk, and the outer is the higher. And so that's the before, and then that's the after. But I like this one, okay? So you can kind of see the reduction, and then you could measure that, and I don't know what it is, but you could say, okay, that might achieve a 45% risk reduction, and then you could actually put a timeline to that. Now, what questions do you have when you start looking at this? Well, one that we had is, see that risk number 9, I think it is, out to the side. The question was, well, why isn't that being reduced? Okay, can we do anything else to reduce that? Why hasn't that come down much? Or even this one down the bottom here, see that big peak? It's like, well, can't we reduce it anymore? That's still high. It's like, okay, well, that's in your platform profile, and you've got aging and degraded ships that are very, very old, that are beyond their life of type. Yes, the way to reduce it is actually to replace the ship, okay? But if within the context is you're going to keep the ship, well, there's only so much you can do to actually reduce the risk. So I don't know, just some examples around that risk profiling and things there as well. But you can see there's lots of different ways to present the information, whether it's at the operational level, whether it's the organisational or the industry profiling level. Okay, so just to summarise, I guess what I've tried to do this morning is just really look at some of the structural things. We've talked through governance and that structure, that high-level structure of how you direct and control the organisation from an oversight perspective. We've gone into some of the management of risk areas and then really looked at the relationship with then the safety management system of where that clicks into it. We've then talked a little bit about risk profiling and some of the fundamentals about, the definition of risk. Risk is a chance of something happening that can impact on your objectives, so keeping that focus. We've talked about the difference between risk assessment and risk management, and then we've looked at some applications of the risk profiling or the summary that sits over it. And hopefully you're getting an idea that there's no right or wrong way to do this. It really just comes down to what it is you're trying to communicate, the decisions that you're wanting to be made within the organisation, and trying to get that level of consciousness, whether or not it's at an operational level, an organisational level, or at an industry level. So what are some of the tips that we can leave with you? Okay, the first tip that I thought would be relevant was you need to design your organisation's risk management framework to cater for what you need and what you want in respect to risk profiling. Okay, it's nice to come to conferences like this and you see someone else's application, you go, oh great, can I have a copy of that, and I'll cut and paste it. But actually you need to design something that works for you, that answers your questions of what you need and what you want in respect to profiling. The next one, tip number 2, link your risk management work back to your governance, your strategic planning, your growth and change in a really formal sense, okay, because that's a real hook, your operational and your safety systems and practices. Tip number 3, don't get caught in over-engineering risk management, okay, really important. I think we can go on this journey and this path to just try and make everything scientific and really over-engineer, a lot of this stuff. I've said keep your practices and the processes practical, real, and meaningful in order to get that decision. And you can do some amazing stuff in the qualitative space. It just comes down to how reliable the information is and how wide you cast that net. Okay, tip number 4. At the end of the day, it's actually about people, and it's so easy to get caught up in the process and the practices and the policies and all the tools and the software and all of this. But at the end of the day, it's actually about your people. And what I've said here is if your people are confused and if they don't understand the risk management side of things, you're not going to position them for success in terms of really good application of this stuff. So that goes back to the how. Okay, in the middle, that philosophy of what it's about and really where that sits. And you can use this set of concepts and principles to help bring that clarity and get rid of that confusion. Okay, and tip number 5 is at the end of the day, risk is dynamic, okay? It doesn't stay the same, and you need to keep your eye on the changes and adapt your methods of risk identification, measurement and profiling in order to really give you what you need. So hopefully, that material's been of use this morning. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I know I've jammed a lot into that, but are there any questions? Yes.
One of the slides, you did mention that, the flow chart, risk management
Yes.
that the definition of the context takes like 40%.
Yep.
On the one hand, and then on the other hand, you said there's no end for it.
Yes, yep.
So 40% of what? There's no end.
Yeah, I think 40% of your time. So if you're doing risk management planning and say you spend a day on it, you would normally spend a couple of hours in establishing the context. If you're doing risk management planning like at that industry level, you might be working on that for 3 months. Okay, so 40% of 3 months, you might be working on that context definition for weeks on end, just to try. And it might be that the information's not available, you need to go out and construct it, which is what we did in that parachute industry. The records weren't there, so guess what we had to do? We had to go out and find the operators, then go out and ask them, what aircraft do you have, how many pilots? So you had to survey and ring people, and that actually takes time. So yeah, I think it's in relation to your time. Now, how much time should you be spending? I think that comes down to this diagram in terms of the level of depth that you're after. Okay, whether you want intuitive risk management, which could be quite quick, whether you want something planned, or whether you want something quite calculated. Yeah. Any other questions? No, everyone's risk profiled out. No, that's great. Well, look, thanks so much for your time this morning. Hopefully that was of interest, and enjoy the rest of your day.